Take your CJ7 all the way to 11. Jeepin' with Cool Guy.
Welcome to another episode of Jeepin' with Cool Guy. Tonight, we're going to go over this pretty amazing specimen of a Jeep CJ7 tub. And what to look for if you're buying a tub from somebody, or if you're buying a CJ7 or a CJ5, what to look for to indicate whether body work has been done or those places that could potentially be problems when you get the thing home and start stripping it down. As we go through this video, you'll notice that I've pretty much got it prepped for paint. I've been fortunate enough to have purchased a Rudy's CJ7 tub, proper year, 1979. There's going to be a little bit of nuances between the body tubs for, I think it's 1981, 82 to 86, and then from 76 to 81. Just minor things. Both tubs, or both segments of that decade, could fit on any CJ7. It's just dependent on little specifics like 2-point seat belts, 3-point seat belts, whether it has a B column, no B column, and a couple other little minor things we'll point out as we go through this. This thing really came almost flawless. I had, as you can tell, there's a little bit of just some body work that I had to do. There was just a little bit of rust that was kind of pitting into certain spots. Nothing really big, but it was a really, really easy setup. Anyways, I'm also going to show you what I've done after I've gotten the body sandblasted and prepping for paint and everything else, so that I waterproof this thing, rust-proof this thing for as long as it possibly can happen. So the more I think about it, that's a lot to cover in just one video. So we'll take this in a step approach. First, let's go over the things to look for on a CJ7 body, because I've had this thing sandblasted and we get to see what the metal actually looks like. These are the things that came from the factory, like certain spot welds and other seams, and the way that they did the seam sealer. It really wasn't done very cleanly or well, for that matter. But that's also part of the character of the CJ7 and the CJ5s. AMC wasn't a great car company, especially later on in their business model. But that's fine. They created a really cool vehicle. So let's keep that character alive. Don't cover it up, but you also want to be able to find these tubs, and they're becoming rarer by the day, in the condition that this one was in, because of these character flaws, which are also character pieces. So we're going to start with the back tailgate area. The tailgate hinge bolts on here, and you'll notice that there's these two spot welds here. These should be here. They shouldn't be. There's very few places on the Jeep panels that should be smooth and flat, even though it is flat metal, because they put spot welds everywhere. So one of the things you can look for is if you look down like the side of the body line, and I'm going to show you that in a second, and you don't see any of the spot welds, you know at that point the whole thing has been bondoed. Like they bondoed over the entire side of the Jeep. Whether they wanted to get rid of the spot welds, I don't know why you would want to do that, because to me that's part of the character of the Jeep, and that's how you can tell it's truly original. Where the back quarter panel meets the cross member for the rear floor pan, they just did a kind of a stitch weld, and it goes right down through here. This one should exist here. Two, it should look like this kind of splatter type weld. This shouldn't be smooth. Now let's talk about the rear floor pan. As you can see, there's a spot welds all the way through here. Some of these, like this one right here, actually has a piece of metal sticking up from it. I actually had to sand this thing off because I actually cut my finger on it, dragging it across once it had been sandblasted. One of the characteristic differences between the 76 to 81 and the 82 to 86 is the rear seat for the CJ7s was stationary. They didn't have the flip up seats. Both of the series had these 3 rear mounting bolts here. For the stationary seat, this is where the back support actually mounts to, as well as the seat belts. For the 82 to 86, this is where the seat belts would be bolted down, the lap belts would be bolted down into. And the flip-up seat sits on these 3 risers that fall right about here. For the 82 to 86, there would be 2 mounting holes here, because since the flip-up seat actually needs a hinge, this is built for just the stationary seat. So you just have the 2 bolts for the front mounting brackets. The 82 to 86 needs 2 bolts because of the hinge that the seat flips up on. This I just learned about the other day. I think it was 76 to 80, they had the bump stop, it would bolt on through these 4 holes. From 81 to 86, the bump stop was attached with screws, sheet metal screws, very thick sheet metal screws. And the bump stop is just a slight bit wider and a little bit flatter for the earlier model CJ7s. So you can't really see it all that well here just because it's been sandblasted, so the contrast and the sheen covers it up. But there should be spot welds all along here. And spot welds here, because here is where the rear wheel well baffle is spot welded to the back quarter panel. Here is where the rear wheel well is spot welded to the side panel and the back quarter panel. So when you get your primer down on this, you should be able to see spot welds all the way through here up to this point, where where the wheel well goes down and then runs along the line of this wheel cutout. So look for those spot welds. If you don't see the spot welds here, and you don't see this seam, you know that body work's been done on this thing. All right, real quick flash forward. The spot rivets I was telling you about. This is what I'm talking about. Can you see the shadows here? Goes along all of these body lines. Well, I mean, if you consider them ugly, it's part of the CJ7. Now, with that said, this is the rear quarter panel to the side panel. This has a inside spot weld that's been done all the way through here. So this should be filled with seam sealer. So this is one of the things that I'm going to talk about real quick about what I did to prep the tub. Once I had this sandblasted, the sandblaster isn't probably going to get rid of most of the seam sealer. It's really hard to get rid of. I took a wire brush on a angle grinder and got rid of all of it. Like, I got all the way down into it, because what happens is that over the course of time, the seam sealer starts to break up, water gets into it, and then it starts rusting out these seams from the inside. So I wanted to clean all of that out. So once I got all the seam sealer out, then I took the Rust-Oleum rust converter, which actually really is good stuff. There's a video out there where the guy tests all the rust converters, and for the dollar amount and what it does, the Rust-Oleum stuff is really good. I just soaked this thing with that rust converter, and then I wiped it all off with paint thinner. And then once that dried, then I applied the seam sealer, and now I have a rust-converted sealed inner lip covered up with some brand new seam sealer. We're good to go there. Another thing that's indicative of the earlier model CJ7s from 76 to, I want to say, 80, 81. There's a lot of discrepancies about what happened in 80, 81, leading up to 82. Most of the stuff was set by 82, but there was a lot of transitions in 80 to 81. Anyways, these are the side marker lights. So in either, I think it was 81, they got rid of the side marker lights, and the rear brake housings have side lenses on them to accommodate for the side marker lights. So this is another indicator of what year or part of that decade that the tub that you have came from. So for me, this right here is what it's all about. For the earlier models, the authentic ones have JEEP stamped into them. That's also very indicative of the YJ tubs, JOOP, and then you just put your sticker on top of this. Also an easy way to tell whether it's a fiberglass tub or whether this whole panel has been replaced. This is where the A column is connected, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So this area right here has a tendency to rust out a lot. So there's a distinct possibility that the rocker panel, this part rusted out and the person just replaced this whole piece. A column or cowl support, whatever you want to call it, that's the piece that runs all the way up to the top part of the cowl and all the way down to the body mount. This is the exact same for 76 to 86, no differences between the two. But what I was talking about earlier is this area right behind this support normally rusts out because there's no sealer behind this support, and it's just a piece of metal connected to another piece of metal by spot welds down here, and then there's a couple that it goes all the way up to where you get up to the actual windshield mounting bracket. Anyways, so water gets in either through the windshield mounting bracket hinge or through the door hinge plates and just leaks down into here, and then it just sits. It has nowhere to go. So this area has a real tendency to rust out. Let me show you how good a shape this one's in. As you can see, there's no rust here. There's a weld that goes right here, a weld that goes up by this folded lip, and a weld that goes by this folded lip. Seam sealer is applied to all of the seams of the connecting pieces on the bottom part of the body tub. I'll show you all that in a minute. But what you can see here is this black stuff is that Rust-Oleum rust converter. So what I had done is I took a wire brush and I got rid of all of the seam sealer everywhere that I possibly could. And then I just hosed down, sprayed as much of that Rust-Oleum rust converter into these seams, wiped up the excess, let it dry, then put the seam sealer down on it, and then I used a universal bonding primer just to make sure that I had sealed the seam sealer, and also so that I had something that would bond really well with the seam sealer itself. Make sure you get yourself a good seam sealer. And the interesting thing about it is when AMC put the seam sealer on here, they did it in a couple different fashions. One, they did it with a pneumatic gun and didn't do really any cleanup to it, or they just used a brush. So the seam sealer is supposed to look bad. I mean, I know it sounds funny, but it's not supposed to be this nice clean line. Let me show you one of the factory parts of the seam sealer that I didn't take out and what it looks like. So this area right here, this is factory seam sealer. I didn't touch it. So you can tell, I mean, you can see it underneath the dash, not very well, but it's not clean. It doesn't look really all that great. So what I did is I tried to replicate that all the way through the tub. Here's another example of a factory seam seal. This is combined with a weld. So this part right here is actually welded. This part up here is seam sealed, and so is this area seam sealed. So where the seam sealer was still in pretty good shape, and I know that I didn't have any rust because I looked at it from the underside lip, I just kept the seam sealer where it was and maybe put just a skim coat over the top of it. But for the most part, I just put a nice good bead of seam sealer on there, and where I needed to, I pressed it into place, then put the primer on top of it. Another difference in the tubs is where the B column would actually be. From 76 to I think it's about 81, this is an open cavity. And there's these two supports, one at the top of the wheel well and the other one at the bottom part of the wheel well at the rear floor riser. And this is where the 2-point seat belts mount. And this forms a nice open cavity, so there's not a lot of rust that forms behind here. In 82, when they put the B column in here, they switched a couple things up. One, the B column is where the retractor for the 3-point seat belts actually connects. And there's two little tiny screw holes here on the upper lip of the side panel for where the new door striker would be. The door striker for the 76 to 81 are these two holes right here at the top of this curve. And this is where, if you watch my video on the 79 Golden Eagle, I talk about what those door strikers are actually like. So there was not only a transition in whether there was a B column or not, but it was also a transition in the paddle handle for the doors or the latch system for the doors. All right, let's talk tub prep. I have gone through a lot and to prep this thing to get it ready to go. What any car painter will tell you is the finish that you're going to get is 90% in reference to what you do to prep. So what I've done is I actually found an industrial blaster company that does, like silos, dump trucks and so on. And they sandblasted this thing for me, but they didn't really know what they were doing, so I wasn't concerned about them warping it or anything. But I mean, there's really not a whole lot on this body that you could warp. But what happens is that when you sandblast it, if you don't do the dustless or the soda blasting, if you do like a regular media blasting, it's going to put a pretty good grit on the metal. So the first thing that you want to do, if you have the time, and I'll also talk about flash rusting here in a moment, get an angle grinder and a wire brush, just like this, and go over the entire body, every single inch, and just smooth off that really rough texture that's applied by the sandblaster. What that does is it gives you the ability to take a nice dust rag or a microfiber over the top of this metal and use a degreaser or acetone to get rid of fingerprints and all the other things. Because if you don't do that and you try and drag any one of those towels, definitely don't ever use a paper towel when you're doing prep work for paint, because it's going to leave lint. But if you use a microfiber towel or the terry cloth type towel, it's going to give you the ability to just wipe all of the spots and not leave anything behind. You can get most of the stuff off with a tack cloth. I do highly recommend using those things. But just smooth out the metal, because when you put your primer down, you're going to have to put it on excessively thick to cover up that texture. So you want to do a little bit of finishing to the surface of the body. You'll also notice that all the way through here there's gray and black and a couple different colors. Start with the gray. The gray is this universal bonding primer. It's not the greatest stuff in the world. You could probably get some better stuff in the paint shop, but I pretty much just used this universal bonding primer, and the reason why I used it just in these areas is because if you look, it's all of the seams. I sprayed this over the top of the seam sealer just to make sure that I had something that would definitely connect with the seam sealer really well. And then I'm going to put my epoxy primer over the top of this, and then that way I'll have a really nice finish. The black, I've already told you about. It's the Rust-Oleum Rust Reformer. And this stuff takes about 24 hours to fully cure and effect. But I sprayed this into every gap, seam, all of the spots where potentially water could have gotten into, or there might be rust lurking in there, to either stop or slow down the rusting process. So this isn't going to get rid of rust. I can show you how to get rid of rust, but I put it into every single spot that I could get. So the way that I did this is I just sprayed it into everywhere that I could get that had a seam, an exposed seam, to where it puddled or started dripping out of. And then I wiped all of that down like 5 minutes later, cleaned up all the excess with lacquer thinner. And that way I have sealed rust, potential for rust, or exposed metal really well, and hopefully this thing outlasts me. The other interesting color in here is this kind of greenish, brownish look. That is the result of phosphoric acid, muriatic acid, being applied to the metal. When I talked earlier about flash rusting, when you get back from your sandblaster you may not have the ability to paint it immediately due to timing, facilities, whatever that may be. So I have tried to figure out how to finagle this thing to have this body with the rolling chassis and my 84 Jeep all in a standard 2-car garage. And I mean, I'm fitting these things in here like a glove. But anyways, and it's been sitting like that for about a week and a half. Potentially, you're going to get flash rusting. I mean, even if you just touch it with your finger after it's been sandblasted, you'll notice in a day or two that that little spot will have some flash rusting to it. It's really kind of frustrating. So go out to Lowe's, Home Depot, or one of your hardware stores and get a gallon of muriatic acid. And I put it in a spray bottle, diluted it like 75% solution or muriatic acid, 25% water, and then you just kind of mist it over all of these areas, wherever you see flash rusting. Or if you want to prep the metal so that it doesn't flash rust, you could do it that way. But that's also a reason why you want to run the wire brush all over everything, is because once you spray this stuff on, then you want to grab yourself a good terry cloth, a good clean terry cloth towel, get this wet, and then soak this with the muriatic acid, squeeze that all out, and then wipe off all the excess muriatic acid. Because what the muriatic acid does is once it dries, it creates this kind of really hard shelled gummy type casing over the top of the metal. And that is a pain in the butt to get off. So what you want to do is you want to spray the areas that are affected or that you want to etch. Wait about 5 minutes and then wipe it off. And if you have a bunch of muriatic acid in this, what it does is it cleans off all the muriatic acid that has built up and the reaction stuff, and then it lays down a really thin coating of this, and it kind of seals the metal a little bit. So this is really easy. I mean, this is a nice simple terry cloth towel, and there's no resistance there. I'm leaving nothing behind. So that's going to give you a really nice finish to put your primer down and ultimately your paint, and you won't have any texturization in there. Okay, so let's get on into what kind of shape this tub is actually in and how nice it is. Not bragging, I'm just really happy that I found this. This is the only area on the whole tub that I really had to Bondo. I'll show you a couple other spots that I just kind of filled in a little bit of rust where it had pitted just a touch. But I guess somewhere along the line, previous owner had the tire carrier on here and either jerked open the tire carrier or did something to the tailgate because it had separated out the quarter panel from the wheel well. So what I had to do is I had to drill out and spot weld 2 spots here and get that back into place. And then it had bent this metal out here a little bit, and there was a slight crack in the metal. So all I did was I took a angle grinder with a cutoff wheel and I cut out the area where the brake was. Then I just butt welded that together, sanded it all down, and then put the Bondo on it just to cover up the imperfections in the weld. This isn't to cover up any imperfections in the Jeep body because the thing's covered in imperfections. This was more of just covering up the weld and where I couldn't get all the way down into the weld without grinding into the metal and creating a problem all over again. Let's talk about seam sealer, where to apply it. Everywhere you see gray on here, this light gray, put seam sealer on it. The floor pan to back cross member, floor pan to wheel well, wheel well to back quarter panel to side panel, back quarter panel to rear cross member, just this gap area over here so that water doesn't run down the tailgate and build up here. Back quarter panel to rear side panel, all the way from the top to the bottom. B column, wheel well, side panel, side rocker, support. If you have a 82 to 86 and you have the B column, you want to put seam sealer all the way around the bottom mount area. Take note, there is a hole, drainage hole side of, or at the bottom part of that B column. And that is to allow water to drain out through here. Now, if you watch my video on replacing the lower B column component, you'll see that. So pay attention to that video because it gives a really good description on how to replace that and what to look for. Seam sealer on the top edge of this support to the sidewall. Seam sealer all the way around, spot welded flange into the wheel well. All the way along the wheel well to the side panel mount. You'll also notice, if you look from the outside, there's spot welds all the way along here. Something else to look for. Seam seal all the way up around this lip, right in through here, right behind the striker connector holes. Along the entire line of the rear floor pan riser. Pack this stuff in, meaning that when you apply this stuff, whether you apply it with a brush or you apply it with a caulking gun, squeeze the stuff in there so that it goes all the way in, and if you can get it, which may not necessarily be the case, have it ooze out the back underneath that lip there. That way that this whole area is nice and sealed up. The one thing that you'll notice, and I think everybody at one point has experienced, unless you have a flawless CJ7, is where the roll bar mounts to the floor. This area rusts out almost in every case. The reason behind that is because they put the roll bar in the body and mounted it and then painted it. So there's really nothing underneath here other than maybe a little bit of primer. So any water that gets underneath here just sits there and it just rusts out. So that's why this whole part behind or in front of this riser and the floor pan mount for the roll bar rusts out. So make sure you get a nice seam of seam sealer in there and you've cleaned it out and put the Rust-Oleum stuff inside of there before you go anywhere. Now, while we're on that subject, when you've got this thing sandblasted and cleaned up, these are welded in nuts on the back part of the riser. They, for the most part, factory welded, spot welded these in one corner. What that does is it not only makes for a weak weld, and these things strip out easily, but it also allows for water to leak in through the back area where this isn't welded to the metal. So if you can, do one of two things. Either weld that nut all the way around and close off that seam, or put seam sealer around the outside of the nut in between the seam of the rear riser and the nut. That way you can cordon off any water getting in through here and just sitting down here and rusting. Seam seal all the way along the firewall to lower floor pan mount. Make sure you've got it in there really well, just like the rear riser for the floor pan. Make sure that that's all the way through, because there's a flange on the other side of this thing that just kind of collects water. So you don't want water to either get in this way or to come in this way. Then there's also this gap down here in this corner that you want to make sure that you get a lot of seam sealer in and fill that up with the seam sealer. You'll find that in this area right up here, which is where the window hinge, outer plate, and the cowl, firewall, floor pan all meet. There's a hole there, and the factory just put a glob of seam sealer in there, and then they just kind of squeezed it. You can almost see where they just pinched it into place. Make sure you have those areas really filled in well so that no water gets in there, because just like you're going to find out, there's characteristic places that these things all rust out in, and it's always in the same spot. The other thing is down here, right where this cowl support is welded to the floor pan. There's this corner where if water gets in here, it just kind of sits down there, and then it gets behind here and it has nowhere to go. So what you want to do is you want to do a really good job seam sealing down here in this corner, right back in here. But you don't want to seam seal the front part of this lip because you want to have somewhere for the water to potentially get out of. And you also want to leave this gap over here open so that the water can potentially get out of there. If you seam seal around all of this, any water that gets in there has nowhere to go. So don't close in the water. Give it an access point to get out from underneath these welded plates. To alleviate that, what I did is I just took that Rust-Oleum stuff, I just sprayed it as much as I could into this back area, underneath these seams, and back in here, and up in here, and through here, so that I could saturate the back part of this plate as much as I potentially could. So hopefully that will help alleviate any problems in the future. Seam seal along this seam right here. This corner right here, this little junction point, is one of the spots that we were just talking about where they pinched the seam sealer from the inside. Seam sealer here, and then seam sealer all along the cowl to firewall meeting. The sandblaster didn't get rid of this stuff. This was in really good shape, so I just left it. So all I did was run a really, really thin skim coat over the top of this thing and then put the primer over the top of it, just to make sure. All along the firewall to cowl seam. This is the lip that the hood fits into. Just make sure you've got this filled in really well with seam sealer. This was a really thick bead of seam sealer from the factory. So just make sure you've got enough in here so that there is nothing that is going to leak in here and just sit. Because there's this little, if you actually get rid of the seam sealer in here, you'll notice that there's this little kind of cutout flange where the cowl and the firewall come together. Don't know what the purpose of it was. Maybe it was part of a drain. I mean, I don't see how effective it was, but make sure you get that filled in really well. I apologize because I probably should have done this before I did all the taping off. I'm not going to peel this thing back off just for this, but you'll get the idea. Right here, where the body panel, the side panel, is connected to the firewall, this is where your front fender mounts. There's 1, 2, 3 bolts. This is a folded flange that is spot welded into place. Over the top of this thing, or this flange, put some seam sealer just over that top edge so that the water that comes down from the cowl in this channel doesn't get behind that lip that your fender is bolted tightly to. Because then at that point, it rusts out from behind this piece, and then that whole front lip, or the whole back lip of your fender starts to rust out. This is also a very consistent place where things rust out. So just run a little bit of seam sealer over the top edge of that flange so that it will direct the water to another place. We're currently under the body right now, and as you can tell, I've got tape all over the place. But I wanted to show you one thing before we're done with this video. All of the floor pan supports, cross-member supports, your sandblaster is not going to be able to get into most of them. So what you want to do, before you take it to the sandblaster, try and hose out as much of it as you can. So if there's any mud or dirt buildup in there, you wash it out. And then get a can of Eastwood's internal frame coating. And that's going to come with this extended, flexible, multi-angled nozzle. And then you're going to want to put the nozzle into each one of these holes of these cross members and just spray the crap out of the inside of these things. Rotate the thing as much as you can so that you get total coverage. And you want to do that for all of the cross members, all of the supports, everywhere underneath this body. All the way up into here, all the way up into here, all of your cross members, everything that's in there that you can't get spray to, because those are the things that are going to rust out because there's no way for the sandblaster to get in there. And if there's no way for the sandblaster to get in there, there was no way for AMC to paint and prep and rust-proof these things, which they didn't do anyways. So there's that. Another thing is I've seen people put seam sealer on the lips of these supports. I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea, because to me, if I put seam sealer out here and water gets in from the back side, then that just holds the water into place. I would much rather have it be able to either go in and get out than just be able to get in and not go anywhere. So I left this open, these seams open wherever I could. What I did to alleviate the potential rust problem was to spray this stuff with this body flipped, so the underside was facing upwards, to where the Eastwood internal frame coating just oozed out of here. And then I used, then I sprayed it from the outside, so I got both sides of the seam. And then wiped all this stuff up, the excess. And then once I got the primer down and everything, it looks really good, and I know that it's protected from rust for the foreseeable future. Just a good thing to do to your underbody, because potentially these are the areas that wind up rusting out the most. And you'll see it on almost every one of the bodies where the rust is coming up from below. It's because it starts from down here and then it goes up and through. I had spoken earlier that any one of the CJ7 tubs from 76 to 86 will fit any year. Yes, for the most part that's correct, with some nuances. This is one that I just discovered and I am not happy about. Mine is a 79. The body for this is a 1980. Well, in 79, that was the last year that they used the T150 and the Dana 20. In 80, they moved to the SR4. The problem with that is that the transmission tunnel is different. My cover is different. So I don't know what I'm going to do now, because I'm not going to go weld something onto the body. I might have to find a 80 and above transmission tunnel cover and cut the bottom of it off and weld it to the bottom part of this. Anyways, we'll see, but let's move on. Alright, that concludes another episode of Jeeping with Cool Guy. I know that there's a lot in this video. I've covered a lot of things, kind of sporadically too. There's a lot to take in here because there's a lot of work that goes into fixing these AMC tubs. They weren't put together very well, but you can potentially get them to be a little bit more timeless than they were originally built. My only request, and this is, I know that this is purely up to the owner of the CJ7, but my plea to you is don't get rid of the character of the CJ7s. I mean, you can cover it with as much bling and chrome and whatever you want to do and drop in engines and stuff like that. But these tubs, there's a lot of character to them. And in my opinion, when you erase that character, you kind of erase what the CJ7 was about to a certain degree. I mean, it's, you know, I know that I'm up on my soapbox, but try and keep that character alive. Don't cover up the spot welds. They're there for a reason. When AMC was originally selling the Jeeps, that was one of the things that a lot of people didn't like about the Jeeps. It was because they looked like they were crappily built. Well, they were. But that's a coveted thing now. One of the things you'll notice is that one of the rarer colors for the CJs was black. And the reason behind that is because it showed up all of the imperfections on the body. So you could really see the spot welds. And as a result, that's why black is such a rare color as an original color for the CJs. And you'll see the triple blacks, like the triple black Laredos, and those things look good no matter what you do to them, if they're original. The spot welds, that's part of what the CJ body is about. So fix what you can. Meaning, you know, make sure that you rust proof it. Get in good seam sealer. Get into all these panels, flanges, and make sure that you get this thing sealed up tight and rust proof it as best as you can. And then get yourself a nice primer and a nice coat of paint on it, and I can almost guarantee you're going to be happier that the spot welds are there and the imperfections are there, because they weren't built to look perfect. They were built to look imperfect, and that's the way that they're supposed to be. So keep the CJ7 character alive. Like and subscribe. Makes me feel better, makes the CJ7 community smarter, and it gets the word out.